Thank you, Ed, for opening our service with that lovely reading from Gordon McKeeman. Gordon was my first mentor in ministry. He taught me as I was just entering the professional ministry that ministry is something so vast and complex that no one person could possibly be good at all of it or do all of it. He also taught me, good old universalist that he was, that the heart of ministry is love. The love that, like a carefully loaded ship, crosses the gulf between generations. Those are the words of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The love that is patient, kind, not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. The love that does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful, does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the right. That's from 1 Corinthians. Or as we learned in the 1966 Ware Lecture at our association's General Assembly, delivered by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he said, the Greek language has 3 words for love. One is the word eros, another is the word phileo, and another is the word agape. I am thinking not of eros or of friendship, but of agape, which is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. I believe, he concluded, that in our best moments in this struggle, we have tried to adhere to this. Now, universalism historically was a belief that a loving God would never condemn anybody to eternal damnation, thus universal salvation. That's where the term universalism came from. Furthermore, universalism teaches that if the God of our understanding loves every single person, it is our duty as universalists to do likewise, to practice agape, to embody agape, to incarnate agape. So reading Gordon's words the other day and remembering what it was like to be in the presence of someone who practiced universal love every moment of his life got me to thinking about what it means to share the ministry today as we emerge gradually from the COVID pandemic into a changed world. At the very beginning of the pandemic, when we thought it was only going to last a little while, I found this lovely reading from Dorset Campbell Ross. Dorset wrote, "Others have said this, but it is worth a reminder. When you go out and see empty streets, empty stadiums, empty train platforms, don't say to yourself, it looks like the end of the world. What you are seeing is love in action. What you are seeing in that negative space is how much we do care for each other, for our grandparents, for our immunocompromised brothers and sisters, for people we will never meet. People will lose jobs over this. Some will lose their businesses, and some will lose their lives. All the more reason to take a moment when you're out on your walk, on your way to the store, or just watching the news, to look into the emptiness and marvel at all of that love. Let it fill you and sustain you. It isn't the end of the world. It is the most remarkable act of global solidarity we may ever witness. Love in action. That is what we have been practicing patiently, or maybe not so patiently, for the last 18 plus months. And that is what we will continue to practice as we take the first tentative steps into multi-platform worship. When we open the octagon for in-person worship, we will all be asked to practice agape in the guise of guidelines that your board is establishing to make that experience as inclusive and accessible as possible. You may be asked on your honor to attend in person only if you have been vaccinated, if you are eligible to be vaccinated. And recognizing that children under 12 are not yet eligible for vaccination, you may be asked to wear your mask at all times while indoors, vaccinated or not, and to practice social distancing. And I really, really hope that you will be asked to do what is, to me, the most important thing of all. You may be asked to practice honoring consent about physical touch. In recognition of the reality that not all of us are ready to hug or even shake hands, Many congregations are using a sticker system so that every person can indicate to others the level of physical touch we are comfortable with. Red means don't touch. Yellow means a handshake or an elbow bump is okay, but nothing else. Green means hugs are okay. I will tell you right now that as a former nurse, I will have a red sticker on my name tag. That doesn't mean I love you less in the agape sense. It means I am not yet comfortable with physical closeness. Having the courage to state your level of consent is what shared ministry is all about. And honoring that level of consent that others express is also what shared ministry is all about. All healthy relationships in shared ministry are based on mutual respect. All healthy relationships in shared ministry are based on establishing and honoring clear and appropriate boundaries. Ministry is all that we do together, and we do it by offering clarity and honoring clarity. So maybe our reopening will be a dramatic example of all of us embodying shared ministry. How about some other examples from history? This one from Henry Nelson Wyman, a Unitarian and process theologian in the 20th century. Process theology, by the way, posits that God is not a noun, but a verb, a divine intention at work in the universe, constantly seeking to influence the direction of our choices without compromising our human freedom. Wyman believed that this divine energy made itself known in interactions among people and interactions between people and the rest of creation. When open-minded and open-hearted people get together in groups designed to be transformative, something happens. He called that something creative interchange. Wyman posited that when Jesus gathered his followers and engaged them in deep and provocative conversations, when he pushed them to think in new categories, to be merciful and compassionate and attentive to those on the margins, creative interchange happened. Reverend Meg Barnhouse describes it this way. Wyman imagines that this new life that Jesus followers experience is not even about Jesus really, but about the creative interchange among them, the way they hear each other and understand each other, the way they love each other and anticipate each other's needs. That's what God is, Wyman says, the transformation that happens for them in community. In that community, the old rituals like sharing a Passover meal or washing each other's feet seem brand new. The tidal wave of energy surges through them again and again. They feel fully and simply present. When Jesus leaves them, or rather, when they leave him as he's taken to trial, and then when Jesus is killed, they think that's all over. They flee for their lives. They hide in their homes and in the countryside. Their disappointment and sense of loss are immense. This wasn't what was supposed to happen, but they can't stay apart from each other. They need each other. And when they come back together, when they mourn together, they begin to feel like they did when Jesus is around. That's what the resurrection means, Wyman says. To paraphrase him, life-transforming creativity previously known only in fellowship with Jesus begins again to work in the fellowship of his followers. It's the sense of their own best selves that has risen from the dead. Since the followers have never experienced this anywhere except with Jesus, they think the man Jesus is actually present, walking and talking with them. But what rises from the dead, Wyman says, is not the man Jesus. It is the creative power that Jesus embodies and that they all felt when they were with him. And what a creative power it turned out to be, right? Think about it. A small sect of uneducated and disparate and frightened people came back together after the disastrous death of their leader and changed the world. They started a movement that 2,000 years later has more than 2 billion followers across the globe. They changed the world so profoundly that we started measuring time over again. What happened in the year one? Well, something happened. something transformative, something amazing, something miraculous, a rebirth of shared ministry in creative interchange. Now, I say rebirth rather than birth because the disciples of Jesus did not invent shared ministry. I suspect that for as long as people have gathered around fires or stared into the abyss, as long as people have been afraid or confused or awed or delighted, there have been attempts to come together and share their experiences. Take, for example, an older story, the story of the Exodus. When the Israelites made the decision to leave their lives of enslavement, packing quickly and stealing away in the night, they probably felt a burst of adrenaline, right? And then at the Red Sea, when the waters parted and they dashed to safety and watched the mighty army of the Pharaoh disappear under the water, well, they danced and sang and celebrated. They were full of high energy and high spirits and high hopes. And then just a little while later, reality set in. They realized they were literally nowhere. They had no food, no means of supporting themselves, no homes. They started to lose faith. They even suggested that it would have been better to live in slavery than to die of hunger in the desert. But they persisted, whoa, yeah, until eventually they arrived at the promised land. Now, at that point, their leader, Moses, died. They had to enter the promised land without him, which they did. And they set about creating communities of faith and power. They shared the stories that had made them a people. They shared the traditions and the rituals and the work. They shared their talents and their treasure. In other words, they created a community that embodied the concept of shared ministry. The time between fleeing Egypt and entering the promised land was approximately 40 years, a generation. The time between the settlement in the promised land and the crucifixion of Jesus was likely more than 1,000 years. But this is really one long story with many chapters. The people who fled in fear after the crucifixion were in some sense the same people who fled Egypt with only the clothes on their backs. The people who discovered the power of community as they made their way in a new land were in some sense the same people who rediscovered the power of community in the dark days after the death of Jesus. The narrative thread of the Judeo-Christian tradition is that of a people who, in the face of calamity, fear, disappointment, loss, and confusion, opt to persevere together over and over again. And you know what? We are those people. Our story is the continuation of that narrative thread. We have experienced highs and lows. We have, in the last year and a half, experienced the most unexpected challenges imaginable. We have had faith and we have lost faith, and we have found our faith again and persevered. We have endured hardships and we have helped each other across deserts, and we have, with fear and trembling, put our toes into a raging sea and seen it part and allow us to pass through. We have learned that between us and among us, we have all the diverse gifts that we need to create and sustain a beloved community. A community that worships together, whether it's on a screen or in a room. A community that learns and grows together. A community where we care for each other and where we break down the barriers that marginalize some and privilege others. I would suggest that the Eighth Principle Project, which many of you were introduced to last week, would be the very project that Jesus would be talking about if he were talking to us today. It's a perfect example of shared ministry, of calling upon the power of agape to dismantle what might seem like an intractable history of oppression and the misuse of power. Remember what Dr. King taught us more than 50 years ago. He taught us that in the best moments of the struggle, if we adhere to the practice of agape, what he called the understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all, an overflowing love which seeks nothing in return, what I would call the basis for our Unitarian Universalist practice of shared ministry. When we adhere to that practice, we find our best selves and discover that together, our best selves can work miracles. When we are at our best, we are what Martin Luther called the priesthood of all believers. That was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. When we are at our best selves, we are what James Luther Adams, another 20th century Unitarian theologian who some of you have become very familiar with in the last 5 weeks, what he called the prophethood of all believers. The priesthood and the prophethood of all believers, practitioners of that vast and complex thing called ministry, that's us. And there is room for every one of you in that ministry of love in action. Ministry really is all that we do together. Let it always be so.